Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of the Graduate School of Oceanography's Ocean Classroom Live. We have live audiences streaming in from Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope on Twitter, so a huge hello to all of you. Before we jump into the program today, I have a really exciting announcement about the launch of our Ocean Classroom Live podcast. So if you've missed watching a live episode, or if you prefer listening while driving, walking, doing chores, anything, you can now find us on Spotify and on Apple Podcast. So when you're there, be sure to subscribe so that you're notified when we have new episodes, and you can share this with your friends. More information can be found on the Ocean Classroom Live webpage, which will be shared with you in the comments. As always, we want to thank the Devereux Ocean Foundation for funding this episode. My name is Hannah McDonald, and I'm a graduate student here at the University of Rhode Island. If you're a reoccurring viewer, welcome back. And if you're new to Ocean Classroom, welcome aboard and join the club. This is my very first time hosting Ocean Classroom Live, and I am super excited to join the Ocean Classroom exploring team with all of you. So as I've mentioned, Ocean Classroom, this is a classroom, and classrooms are interactive. So we want to be hearing from you. We want to engage you with your questions. We want to hear your comments. Anything, we want you to type in the chat. And to get you comfortable with this, I want to hear from you where you are streaming in from. And since today's episode is about talking trash, if you've ever encountered trash in a water body, let us know that as well. So I'm originally from the Great Lakes, where the water body is there, Lake Huron for me, and I would often find straws in the water there. That's me as a tiny human, hopefully avoiding some of the trash on the beach. And in the ocean, I've also encountered trash on the coast too, including balloons off the coast of California. So those are the two common pieces of trash that I have found. Before I formally introduce you to the professors today, the presenters, I want to ask them as well. Have you ever encountered trash in the water? So, Professor J.P. Walsh, what about you?
Unfortunately, I've encountered way too much trash along the coast. And one of my nice activities to do is I like to take a walk or swim at the beach here where I work. And one day I was taking a snorkel, and during that snorkel, I saw this little piece of orange plastic and actually captured this video. So I thought I'd share that with you all. Of course, as you all go to the beach, you've probably seen wrappers and cigarette butts and other things. And that's just one of the unfortunate realities. Some of it ends up into the ocean, as you can see here.
That's a very interesting video to have captured too. Matt, what about you? Have you ever encountered pollution of any sorts in the water?
Yeah, of course. I grew up going to the beaches here in Rhode Island, and at the end of the season, especially in August, after all the tourists have left, I'm sure we've all seen plastic bags floating in the water. Maybe you think it's jellyfish or a fish or a piece of seaweed, just little things like that, straws, wrappers, food wrappers, all that stuff.
Yeah, seems to be a pretty common problem. So I want to hear from our viewers. Do we have any of our comments coming in? Oh, it looks like we have someone coming in from Queens, New York. No trash here. That is great news. A little bit surprising, but maybe it's because it's tiny trash. We also have a viewer coming in from Alaska who has participated in many cleanups for 30 years. That's incredible. Lots of plastic. Not surprising. And we have someone joining in from the VIMS campus over in Virginia. Hello. Welcome. We have someone close by, Jamestown, Rhode Island, and they find trash on the beach there often. Wow. Well, it's great to know that we have viewers coming in from all over, even up in Alaska. That's great. Alaska to Rhode Island, that spans the entirety of the United States. So that is great. As I've mentioned, this is an interaction, so we want you to keep using that chat box throughout the live program today, asking us your questions to our presenters here, as well as typing in any comments that you might have. So if you're on YouTube, that would be the chat box. If you're in the Facebook video player, that would be the comments section. If we can't get to your questions in the program live, we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you're watching this in replay, or if you're one of our podcast listeners, you can send us your question as well, and we will try to address it as soon as possible. All right. So today's Season 2, Episode 2 Ocean Classroom Live is all about talking trash. We're going to be learning about tiny trash today, things like microplastics and chemical contaminants called PFAS. And we are going to be learning about how those tiny trash are connected to the ocean's health and our own health. So with that, I want to introduce you first to Dr. J.P. Walsh, who is the director of the Coastal Resources Center and a professor at the Graduate School of Oceanography here at the University of Rhode Island. He is a geographical oceanographer interested in understanding coastal processes and hazards. So JP, can you tell us some of the questions you're trying to answer with your research, and then some of the things that the Coastal Resource Center does?
Yes, thanks, Hannah. So my research focuses on sediment dynamics. So basically particles that move around in the ocean. And that, of course, relates to things like shoreline erosion as well as habitat loss. Currently, I'm leading a project that, in fact, was funded by the funds raised by the fraternities and sororities at URI, a project looking at plastic along the shoreline and seafloor of Narragansett Bay. I'm also involved in research on habitats in the Philippines and in other places. Shown here is actually a picture. I've had the pleasure of working a lot of great students in Rhode Island and with a student in Guam over the summer. And here they are doing a variety of sampling and analysis to better understand plastic in the marine environment. And maybe I'll quickly mention the Coastal Resources Center, where I'm really proud to work. We focus on bringing science to societal issues in Rhode Island and around the world. And we're lucky to have a talented staff working with people across URI and partners internationally.
That's great. What a scope of projects you're working on. Now, I also want to introduce you to our other presenter. He is a third-year PhD student at the University of Rhode Island's Bay campus, the Graduate School of Oceanography. And Matt grew up just down the road from campus in South Kingston, Rhode Island. His focus for his research is on the detection of forever chemicals, or what we call PFAS, which is an acronym that I am sure Matt will explain to us. And he is all about using simple and affordable tools to understand where they are coming from in their environment, both locally and globally. So, Matt, can you tell us about some of the questions your work is trying to address? And then can you introduce us to the STEEP project?
Yeah, so my work is with a thing called passive sampling, which is a really simple process, which is where you basically put something in the water that requires no power source, no energy line, no maintenance or upkeep, and it uptakes a little bit of the contaminants that we're talking about. There's a good picture of them. It's a little white tube, and it slowly uptakes a little bit of the contaminant that we're talking about, PFOS, each day over the course of its deployment. We then take that back in the lab, we measure how much PFOS is in there, and we can use that, and we're trying to use that to understand how much pollution there is in, say, a river or an ocean or groundwater. And then STEEP is the Superfund Center here at the University of Rhode Island's Bay campus, or I should just say at the University of Rhode Island. It's much bigger than just the Bay campus. It stands for Sources, Transport, Exposure, and Effects of PFOS. And we're basically just studying all those things across the Bay campus, across pharmacy, and we also have colleagues at Harvard working on similar things. And we're looking at what do PFOS do biologically to people. That's the work done in pharmacy, whereas our work on the Bay campus is more on the ocean and the environmental side.
Great. That's a completely different type of pollution than microplastics and marine debris. So I assume that both of those topics will inspire many questions coming in from our audience. So that just serves as a reminder to type in your questions on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're streaming in from, for our guests. So with that, I want to kick it off with one of my first questions for you, JP. And I want to know if that orange piece of plastic that you found would be considered a microplastic. If not, what is a microplastic?
Good question, Hannah. Well, basically with plastic, what we do is we try and simplify and focus on different size classes. So the piece of plastic that I showed you is larger than microplastic. This is on the order of 1 inch. And what you can see in the figure shows us the different classes for plastic. So at the very small end on the right, we have nanoplastics, which are really tiny. Then you have microplastics, which are in the range of 1 micron to 5 millimeters. And then you have mesoplastics going from 5 millimeters to 2.5 centimeters, which is about 1 inch. And then bigger than that, you have macroplastics and megaplastics, which are really large pieces. So this piece of plastic that I'm holding is probably in the meso to macro range. It's right about around the boundary because it's about 1 inch.
Great. And do you have any idea of where that orange piece came from? Is it a broken off piece of something larger?
That's a great question. And that's one of the challenges with plastic is that in many cases, they're fragments. The plastics basically break down from larger things. And so I don't know what it looks like. Maybe it was a flotation, perhaps, that fragmented in response to different processes.
Very interesting. We have a question coming in from YouTube from Gabrielle. And this question could spark a debate between both of you. And that is, what would you consider to be a larger threat to the ocean, microplastics or forever chemicals? I think now's the time for, maybe let's have Matt make his case first.
That's a very tough question. And there's no direct answer. The issues with forever chemicals is that we just still don't know so much about them. And when I say forever chemicals, I'm talking about PFOS. Forever chemicals is just a simplification of describing them because they're persistent, which means they don't go away, they bioaccumulate. We still don't know a lot about them. So I'm biased in saying that I think they probably pose a bigger issue to humans than our overall ocean. But they're going to be a challenge that will be a long time, and we'll be fighting for a long time in the future.
JP, do you have an argument to that?
I think that's a very safe answer, and I'm going to agree with Matt that we don't know is the sad reality because the science, we're still learning. I think one of the points I will make, though, what we do know is that plastics in our oceans are already killing and disrupting different organisms and the ecosystem. There's been plenty of work documenting turtle impacts, bird impacts, and smaller organisms. So the question is, and there we have an example of a turtle, a baby turtle, that inside its gut was over 100 pieces of plastic, all different shapes and sizes. There's so many examples from birds that we can see. And that's because in many cases, those animals are seeing that as potential food and eating it, and it'll accumulate in the body of the organism.
Wow, that is 100 pieces in a turtle. That's crazy. What are the impacts of PFAS? And maybe, Matt, if I could have you break that down a little bit more, maybe define it for us before we dive really far into this program. And then what are their impacts on, say, a sea turtle or even humans?
Yeah, so PFOS stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, which is a big fun word, but basically what that means is it's a carbon chain, so a bunch of carbons that's usually fully fluorinated, which is what per means, or partially fluorinated, which is what poly means. Here's an example of that. The top one is a common PFOS called PFOA. You can see all the carbons are fluorinated except for the one at the end, which is what we call, that's a separate part. We call that the reactive head group. The bottom is an example of a polyfluorinated, where you see that not all the carbons are fluorinated. And those have, mostly when we're talking about PFOS, we're talking about legacy ones that we know a little bit more about and have been around for longer, like PFOA. And some of their unique impacts on humans and wildlife. To say that we still don't fully know that is probably the correct answer, especially because I'm not a pharmacist, I'm not a toxicologist, I'm an oceanographer, but there's a lot of evidence of really negative human and wildlife impacts, things like fatty liver disease, increased cholesterol, high cholesterol, obesity, and links to some cancers. That's what we think of mostly for humans, and that is when you're exposed to PFAS, even in very little amounts over a long time. So that's another important thing to understand for wildlife in the ocean and for humans is this is something that hurts you when you have a little bit of it over a long time. Not necessarily if you drink a glass of water with it right at this moment. We talk about long-term exposure a lot of times. So for wildlife, the biggest threat that I'll just quickly mention is bioaccumulation. So the PFAS gets into the ocean. It gets into plankton. The fish eat the plankton. A penguin eats the fish. You're accumulating these compounds in higher levels. Things that we might eat, a big predatory fish that we might eat could have a lot of PFAS in it, which is then a danger to us.
Very interesting. And it reminds me of some of the things I read about microplastics as well. Before I ask JP the question I have on microplastics, I want to remind you to send your questions into the chat features on both YouTube and Facebook. We want to answer your questions, so send them our way. But to feed off of that, JP, I was wondering if microplastics act the same way. Is there a worry of bioaccumulation in maybe seafood of microplastics, and how does that impact us?
Great question, Hannah. Well, absolutely. There's the concern of bioaccumulation. As I mentioned earlier, certainly organisms of all sizes can eat. If you remember back to the different plastic particle sizes, all different types of organisms can eat plastic on their based on their size, but then they can also eat other organisms that are eating plastic. So that can accumulate. And that is one of the challenges that we face is that as you go up the food chain, you may have higher concentrations of plastics that are found. What this image is showing us is where some of these small plastics or microplastics are coming from. And that's from the breakdown of larger pieces of plastic. So shown here at the water surface, you can see a large piece of plastic, and physical and chemical processes can break plastic down and make it increasingly smaller, and also associated and release chemicals in the process.
So it seems like both of the problems that we're talking about today have a common denominator of chemicals and our ingestion of them. We have a question coming in from the Ocean Alaska Science and Learning Center. And this one's geared for you, Matt. Do PFAS exposures come primarily through ingestion, or can it enter an organism in any other way?
It's a good question, and it really depends on what organism you're talking about. So for humans, it's probably through ingestion, eating something that has a lot of PFAS in it, or more commonly, drinking water that's contaminated with PFAS. That's a big source to the human population. Whereas for organisms, they can do something like a fish swimming around. Yes, it's from ingesting it, it's from taking in the water. We might call that passive uptake, which is, because a fish spends its whole life in the water, it's drinking water all the time, it's eating, potentially some absorbing through things like the gills, but mostly it's ingestion because it is a very water-soluble compound. So,
good to know. We have a question coming in from Jane, and this is a question that I have as well. How do carbons become fluorinated, and what does a fluorinated carbon necessarily mean?
That's a great question too. So carbons become fluorinated in the lab. So somebody did this. Somebody created these compounds. They're man-made. They're not existing. This is a picture of some of the current ones that they're using to replace the old ones. So that means they're making them a little bit differently to try to meet new regulations that governments around the world might be setting. The important thing about a fluorinated carbon is that that's a very stable bond. So when you have a carbon in the chain that's fully fluorinated, like at the end of that chain, there's a carbon with 3 fluorines. In the middle, there's a carbon with 2 fluorines. that's very stable. That's why we call them kind of forever chemicals. That will not really degrade. It will not really be like when somebody eats it, they really won't get rid of it very quickly. It will take a long time, and you cannot break it down really into other parts within your stomach. We call that being metabolized. You cannot really metabolize it. So it's very strong, which is what makes it really good at its job, in our public usages of it. And just quickly, we use it into waterproof things. We use it to make Teflon. We've used it to make in the metal plating field. And maybe what impacts most of us is arguably aqueous film forming foams, which are foams they use to basically put out gasoline fires. So that's kind of where you might see it in the real world and why it's so good at its job, because it won't break down.
That's really, really fascinating. We have a question coming in from Nevin. I think it popped up on the screen a moment ago from YouTube. Are there any other types of forever chemicals besides PFAS, and do those pose a risk to ocean life?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's thousands of man-made chemicals in the ocean. I just happen to there's also thousands of PFOS chemicals. I just happen to focus on a few PFOS chemicals that we know about, but PFOS chemicals are what we would call a POP, a persistent organic pollutant. They're just one of many things like PCBs historically, PAHs, dioxins, if you've ever heard of that. I think everybody knows about the DDT, if you've ever heard about that. That was very popular 10, 20, 30 years ago in education because it was basically wiping out the bald eagle population through a bunch of advanced science. So it's just one of many, many compounds in the ocean.
That's really interesting. JP, we have a really interesting question coming in from YouTube from Benjamin. And his question is, what risk is posed by the equipment used to study and clean microplastics potentially breaking off pieces and contributing to the problem? So off of this question too, I think it would be really interesting to know what types of equipment tools exist to examine microplastics.
Oh, that's a great question. So a lot to cover there. First, when we try and understand plastics in the ocean, there's different parts of the ocean. Some people are looking at the water, and I should highlight researchers that you are across your eye are looking at different parts of it. Some are looking at the water. Some folks are looking at the sediments, like myself. Others are looking at the organisms. And the techniques used are different for all of those. And I probably don't want to review all of them, but for example, for the water, simply what we do is sort of drag basically like a net through the water. And in that, it'll filter the particles out that'll get caught in the net at the very bottom end of the net. And then you can look at the materials caught there. Now, the question of whether or not those processes can create more plastics, I think the reality is we probably collect more problems than we create. But there has been some concern in the literature about the process of analyzing for the plastics. We can break them up and create more numbers of plastics. So how we measure can potentially be impacted by the process of collection, and that is a challenge that we face as we try and study the problem.
That's a really interesting looking net too. Is it actually called a manta trawl, or is that just my version based off of what I think it looks like?
It is called a manta toe or manta trawl. Yep, and that's just it. You has those wings like a manta ray flying on the surface there and collecting in its mouth. And actually, I had the wonderful experience of swimming with a manta many years ago, and not quite the same experience as a manta ray.
Now, we have a question coming in from Jean from YouTube, and I'm going to go off of the manta trawl example. I don't think I'm going to be walking around the beaches in the summer with a manta. Do you have any other ways that we can help enjoy the water and solve pollution problems in the ocean?
Yeah, so a great question. One of the challenges is we need to evolve as a society in how we manage our waste. In general, I would say in the United States, we do a pretty good job, but there's always, we've all been to the beach after a sunny day, and there's debris, there's wrappers, there's et cetera, that people inadvertently allow sort of to leave their area. So this is something we need to work on also in our daily lives. Trash flies out of the car, or it maybe a trash bin gets knocked over, or it's overflowing and people add more. All these are examples of sort of mismanaged plastic that can end up, and it's not just plastic, other debris that can end up in the environment. That picture that was just shown was from right near Providence, Rhode Island, where you can see a lot of different types of debris on the shoreline there.
And Matt, I'm going to turn that back over to you. So mismanaged plastic is something that we can work on for plastic. But what about PFAS? Are there things that we can do to help mitigate PFAS pollution?
To some degree. It's definitely not as clear cut as plastics, because the regulation of things like PFOS and the use of them in manufacturing and consumer products is a lot of times out of our hands as people, though we can certainly tell your representatives and raise awareness. Just be aware of what they're in. And for example, there's a lot of things in everyday life that PFAS are in that we don't really know, that I don't think the general public knows about. So your pizza box, some of them used to be and might still be coated with a fluorinated substance. Microwave popcorn, waterproof furniture, waterproof rain jackets. So try to reduce, use of things like that. Try to look for brands that offer a waterproof rain jacket that maybe uses something like silicone instead of fluorinated compounds. Replace your Teflon pans with cast iron or maybe ceramic, and just check out the resources on the Steep website to kind of look for some alternatives and look for the type of consumer products to avoid.
Thank you. That's good to know. So this season on Ocean Classroom, we are bringing in students into the classroom to ask us their questions. So we have a video submission coming in from Molly. I think we'll run it now, and then I'll encourage you to send in your own video questions for the next episode.
Hi, I'm Molly, and I have a question. How are we supposed to make the ocean better if we keep on making it worse?
That is a great question, Molly. I will turn it over to you, JP, first.
That's a great question. And I think, Molly, what we really need to do is sort of rethink what we're doing with our waste and management. What I really want to encourage first is we should reuse things when possible, and we should refuse new things when we're able to. Reduce what we use, repair items, and recycle everything we can. Those are really important points. Reuse, refuse, reduce, I'd like to highlight more than recycle. And then on the right, we as a society need to be thinking about the lifetime of products, not just what we want to buy to do things, but also what's going to happen with that when we use it, when we stop using it. And so this is something that we need to encourage people that are involved in construction and in development of products to think about the overall impact and the sort of the future of a product after its primary use is over.
That's a great answer. We have a pretty fascinating question coming in from Robert on YouTube, and it's changing the scope that we've been focusing on from species in the ocean and humans to, does it pose a threat to shoreline vegetation? So Matt, I'll turn it over to you first, and then we'll go over to you, JP.
That's a very good question. I'm an oceanographer, not really a toxicologist, so I don't know if there's a specific harm that these PFAS do when they accumulate in plants that's different from other wildlife and organisms. I'm very interested in that question he asked about the filtering it out. That's actually something I hope to really research in the future, is looking at how we can use natural shoreline vegetation to help filter out PFAS, potentially as it's coming from urban areas into rivers. PFAS, like a lot of these persistent organic chemicals, they can bind to things in the environment and therefore no longer be free floating in the water. So they could bind to a particle, they could bind to sediment, they could bind to vegetation roots that could potentially immobilize them and make it easier to remediate them. that is a question I hope to answer with the rest of my career, quite frankly.
That's great. And JP, what do microplastics have an impact on with vegetation?
As far as sort of having a negative impact on the vegetation, I can't think of one off the top of my head. But I will say that, I want to reiterate what Matt said, is that our coastal vegetation areas are places where we trap sediments, and those often have pollutants associated with them. And they also trap plastics. Many times when I've been out kayaking and exploring coastal wetlands, you can find that these are many of the places where that trash ends up, and that's good because it's sort of our filter for our coast. But of course, this is also a critical place where young organisms are living and growing, and can end up being problematic as as we talked about with bioaccumulation and longer term impacts.
That makes total sense. So I have one final question, and it's inspired by the photo of Matt in the river, and it'll be to both of you before we wrap up. And that's, could you summarize a day in the life of your job as a researcher here in the trash expert field, for our audience, just to give them a little snapshot of what you really do? Matt, I'll go to you first because I know you have a slogan with this.
A slogan? So generally, if I'm having a good day, you're out in the field and you're basically just splashing around in the water, getting sunburned and having a good time. Unfortunately, when you're talking about these pollutants like PFAS, they exist in the water at a nanogram per liter scale. So for reference, that is about one drop of water in an Olympic-sized pool. That's how much PFAS there could be in the water that is still of concern to us, that little. So it's a lot more lab chemistry, a lot more of me going into the lab, cleaning things, rinsing them with various solvents, playing with those, cutting them off their little lines, and doing a lot of hardcore chemistry. Unfortunately, not as much fun as the field work.
And JP, what about you? Can you give the viewers a snapshot of what a day in the life looks like for you?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, a lot of my days are spent behind this computer and connecting, either doing research or planning other projects. Some of my favorite days, of course, are out in the field when we're sampling, getting muddy and wet. But I also, another part of my job that I really love is connecting people and sharing stories. And actually, one story I wanted to share was the story of some local work where a teacher at a local school has been built a drifter with her class, her students. And that drifter was deployed by the research vessel, the URI's research vessel, the Endeavor. And it was deployed off our coast and has drifted out into the ocean really rapidly. What is really powerful to that, not only is it shows us what currents do and how they move water around the earth, but also it shows us how plastics, things that pollution that may unfortunately make it into the sea can make it out to the open ocean. So it's stories like these that I really enjoy sharing, and that's a major part of my job. So thanks to them and to you all.
Thanks so much, JP. I'm glad you were able to share that story and connect with the public, an aspect of your job that you like, with us here today. And we have Curtis Corner Middle School tuning in with us today, the classroom that launched that drifter. So this is a fantastic full circle story moment here. With that, we've already kind of addressed on some of our homework, our calls to action for this episode, from Molly's question on what can we do to help the ocean. So in a final remark, JP, is there one thing that you want to have the students address as a call to action or homework to help save the ocean?
I think something we all need to think about is using less, reducing what we use and managing. Yes, it's good to recycle, but it's also better to not demand as much. So reuse and reduce, I would strongly encourage us all to think about.
And Matt, what about you? One final homework assignment for our viewers today?
Same thing. Look at the resources, see what PFOS is in, and reduce the demand for those products. Buy waterproof materials that don't use fluorinated compounds. don't use microwave popcorn that has fluorinated compounds. Same deal.
Thank you so much, both Matt and JP, for being our trash experts today on episode 2 of season 2. One quick reminder before we go is to follow URI Graduate School of Oceanography on Facebook and YouTube, as well as the Inner Space Center, so that you can stay up to date on these episodes and so much more. I also want to give a special call out to the Ocean Art Competition. Now, the submissions were due earlier this week, but if you're a student that has submitted to the Ocean Art exhibit, maybe this episode about marine trash has inspired you to submit a piece on something like that. And for the rest of us viewers, the art exhibit will be viewable online in April and in Providence, April 5th through the 29th. I also want to give a huge shout out to the Devereux Ocean Foundation once again, and our community of listeners and viewers, both on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and now our podcasters. So our next Ocean Classroom episode is going to be March 18th, where we'll be talking about ocean exploration, so you won't want to miss it. And lastly, we also want to highlight topics that you are interested in. So if you are available to fill out the feedback form in the comments before leaving today's program, that would be greatly appreciated. And maybe our next episode will be based on a topic that you suggested. With all that, I want to thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.